October 20th, 1943, Gestapo headquarters, Pawiak Prison, Warsaw. SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Weber slammed the file onto the interrogation table, watching the woman across from him flinch at the sound. Irina Sendlerowa, a Polish social worker arrested 3 days earlier, sat with her hands folded in her lap despite the obvious pain from the beating she had endured. Weber had broken stronger men than this slight 33-year-old woman, but 3 days of interrogation had produced nothing. Not one name, not one address, not one admission beyond what the Gestapo already knew. She worked for the welfare department. She had a pass to enter the ghetto. She claimed to be checking for typhus. That was all she would say. What enraged Weber most was what his investigators had discovered in the past 72 hours: interviews with ghetto guards, reviews of entry logs, calculations based on children reported missing from ghetto records. The numbers told an impossible story. Over the past 18 months, approximately 2,500 Jewish children had vanished from the Warsaw Ghetto, not escaped through tunnels, not hidden in attics by their parents, vanished completely, transported out of the ghetto under the noses of German guards, SS patrols, and Polish collaborators. And every trail led back to this woman and the network she refused to identify. Weber lit a cigarette and studied Sendlerowa through the smoke. "Your work was very thorough," he said in German, which he knew she understood. "We found the records, Frau Sendlerowa. Names, addresses, new identities. All those children you thought you saved. We will find every single one and send them where they belong." The woman's eyes flickered with something: fear, defiance. Weber couldn't read it, but her silence continued. What Weber didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that the records he thought he had found were incomplete decoys. The real records, containing the true identities and locations of 2,500 Jewish children, were buried in glass jars in a garden across Warsaw, waiting for the war to end. And the network that had smuggled those children to safety was far larger, more sophisticated, and more determined than the Gestapo had comprehended. The story of Irina Sendler and the rescue of Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto represents one of the most extraordinary resistance operations of World War II. It demonstrates how courage, organization, and moral clarity could achieve the impossible under the noses of a regime that considered itself omnipotent. The Nazis believed they controlled Warsaw absolutely. They believed Jewish children trapped in the ghetto had no escape. They believed Polish resistance was fragmented and ineffective. On every count, they were catastrophically wrong, and a young social worker with a network of conspirators would prove just how wrong by executing the largest rescue of Jewish children by a single individual during the Holocaust. To understand the magnitude of Sendler's achievement, one must first comprehend the Warsaw Ghetto and the Nazi system designed to make escape impossible. The ghetto was established in October 1940, forcing over 400,000 Jews into an area of 1.3 square miles, approximately 30% of Warsaw's population crammed into less than 3% of the city's area. An 11-foot wall, topped with barbed wire and broken glass, surrounded the district. German guards and Polish Blue Police patrolled the perimeter. Crossing points were controlled with brutal efficiency. Anyone attempting to leave without authorization was shot on sight. The penalty for Poles caught helping Jews was death, not just for the helper but for their entire family. The ghetto was designed as a death trap even before the gas chambers. Starvation rations of 184 calories per person per day guaranteed slow death. Typhus and other diseases ravaged the overcrowded population. Bodies lay in the streets each morning, victims of hunger and disease collected by carts for mass burial. The mortality rate reached 6,000 per month by early 1941. Nazi administrators openly discussed the ghetto as a temporary holding facility. The Jewish population would die from disease and starvation, or they would be deported to extermination camps. Either way, the result was the same: total elimination. Children suffered most acutely in the ghetto. Malnutrition stunted growth and caused diseases that would mark survivors for life. Orphans wandered the streets after their parents died from disease or were deported. Children as young as 5 learned to smuggle food through gaps in the wall, risking death for a loaf of bread. The mortality rate among children exceeded that of adults. By 1942, tens of thousands of Jewish children in the ghetto faced certain death unless someone intervened. The Nazis believed intervention was impossible. They controlled every entrance, monitored every person with authorization to cross, and had created a system of terror that discouraged Polish assistance through public executions of anyone caught helping Jews. Irina Sendler had different ideas about what was possible. Born in 1910 to a Catholic family, Sendler had been raised with values that made collaboration with Nazi genocide unthinkable. Her father, a physician, had died in 1917 from typhus contracted while treating Jewish patients other doctors refused to see. His final lesson to his 7-year-old daughter was simple: if you see someone drowning, you must try to rescue them, even if you cannot swim. This principle would guide Sendler's actions throughout the war. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Sendler was a social worker for the Warsaw Department of Health and Social Services. Her position provided access to the ghetto under the pretext of controlling infectious diseases, a concern the Germans took seriously given their fear of typhus spreading beyond the walls. Sendler quickly recognized that her official role provided cover for rescue work. The question was how to transform access into actual rescue operations on a scale that mattered. The logistics of smuggling children from the ghetto seemed impossible. The children had to be physically removed past guards who shot on sight. They needed false identity documents that would pass scrutiny. They required safe houses on the Aryan side, willing to risk death by harboring them. They needed ongoing support, food, money, and protection. Each child rescued required coordination between multiple conspirators, any one of whom could betray the entire network under torture. The Gestapo had informers everywhere. One mistake meant death for everyone involved. Sendler began cautiously in late 1940, with individual children whose parents had died and who would otherwise perish on the streets. She secured false documents through the underground, identifying Polish families willing to take Jewish children. The first rescues used the simplest method. Children were walked out through checkpoints using false papers claiming they were Polish. This worked for children who looked Aryan and could speak flawless Polish. But most ghetto children were obviously Jewish in appearance, spoke Yiddish better than Polish, and would be identified immediately at checkpoints. More creative methods were required. Sendler recruited colleagues from the welfare department who shared her determination to resist genocide. Together, they formed what would become known as the Zagota Children's Division, a network of social workers, nurses, and volunteers who would execute increasingly sophisticated smuggling operations. The key was exploiting the infrastructure that connected the ghetto to the outside world. Ambulances crossed the border regularly to transport patients. Garbage trucks and supply vehicles entered and exited daily. The courthouse and tram system ran through both sides of the wall. Each represented a potential smuggling route, if properly exploited. The ambulance method became one of the most effective early techniques. Sendler would enter the ghetto in an ambulance on legitimate business, identifying children for rescue. The children would be sedated with small doses of medication to keep them quiet and hidden in compartments designed for medical supplies or beneath stretchers carrying adult patients. Some children were placed in coffins declared to contain typhus victims. Betting correctly that guards would not examine cargo they feared was contaminated, the ambulances would exit through checkpoints where drivers had been bribed or intimidated, delivering their hidden cargo to safe houses on the Aryan side. Younger children presented unique opportunities. Infants and toddlers could be concealed in toolboxes, sacks, and packages carried by workers, with authorization to cross the border. Sendler developed a network of collaborators among Polish workers, plumbers, electricians, and maintenance personnel who crossed daily for legitimate work inside the ghetto. These workers would hide small children in their equipment and cargo, smuggling them out under the guards' noses. One infant was smuggled in a mechanic's toolbox, another in a burlap sack labeled potatoes. The methods were desperate and dangerous, but they worked. The courthouse method exploited a peculiarity of ghetto geography. The courthouse at Lesno and Ogrodowa streets had entrances on both the ghetto side and the Aryan side. People with legal business could enter from the ghetto and exit to the Aryan side under guard supervision. Sendler's network bribed courthouse personnel to allow children to enter from the ghetto, change clothes in courthouse bathrooms, and exit to the Aryan side with false documents. The children would arrive looking like ghetto Jews and leave looking like Polish children. Guards saw people entering and different people leaving, never connecting them as the same individuals. The tram system provided another ingenious route. One tram line, number 8, ran through the ghetto with stops on both sides of the wall. The Germans allowed this for their own convenience, but it created opportunities. Children small enough to escape notice would board the tram in the ghetto and hide under seats or in operator compartments. As the tram left the ghetto, they would emerge on the Aryan side at a prearranged stop where network members waited to collect them. The method required split-second timing and cooperation from tram operators who risked execution if discovered. The sewer system represented the most desperate escape route. Warsaw's storm sewers ran beneath the wall, offering a foul but functional passage from the ghetto to freedom. Older children who could navigate the darkness and filth used this route, guided by Polish sewer workers who knew the system's layout. The journey through human waste in pitch darkness traumatized children who survived it, but the alternative was deportation to Treblinka. The choice was clear, even if the method was nightmarish. Each smuggling operation required elaborate planning and coordination. Sendler maintained detailed records of every child's real identity, their assumed Polish name, and their placement location. These records were essential if families survived the war and sought to reclaim their children, but the records also represented catastrophic danger. If the Gestapo captured them, every child, every safe house, every member of the network would be identified and destroyed. Sendler developed a system of ultimate security. She wrote the information on thin tissue paper in tiny handwriting, rolled the papers into tight cylinders, sealed them in glass jars, and buried them in a garden beneath an apple tree at a colleague's house. The location was known to only 2 people. If Sendler died, the records would survive. The network grew rapidly through 1941 and 1942 as word spread among desperate Jewish parents. Mothers and fathers faced impossible choices: keep their children in the ghetto, where deportation to death camps seemed inevitable, or give them to strangers who promised rescue but offered no guarantees. The parents who chose to surrender their children often never saw them again. They were murdered at Treblinka, while their children survived with Polish families, bearing Polish names, practicing Catholicism, with no memory of their true identities. The psychological cost of these separations was incalculable. Sendler developed protocols for persuading parents to surrender their children. She would explain the alternatives plainly. Staying means death. Leaving means possible survival. She never lied about the risks or made false promises about reunification. Many parents refused, unable to imagine sending their children away. Others agreed immediately, understanding that separation was their children's only chance. The hardest cases involved single parents who knew that sending their child away meant dying alone. Sendler witnessed scenes of farewell that haunted her for life. Mothers kissing children goodbye, knowing they would never meet again. Fathers whispering final words into ears that were too young to understand. Children crying for parents they would forget. The receiving network on the Aryan side required as much organization as the smuggling operation itself. Each child needed placement with a Polish family willing to risk execution by harboring a Jewish child. Finding such families required trust networks built through religious organizations, resistance connections, and personal relationships. Sendler worked with Catholic convents and orphanages that agreed to hide Jewish children among their Polish charges. She coordinated with the underground to identify sympathetic families across Warsaw and beyond. Each placement required vetting to ensure the family was genuine and capable of maintaining the deception under scrutiny. The children themselves required preparation for their new lives. They had to learn Catholic prayers and rituals perfectly to avoid exposure. They had to abandon Yiddish and master Polish without accent. They had to memorize their false names and family histories so thoroughly that they would respond instinctively even under surprise questioning. For young children, this meant forgetting their real identities entirely. Sendler struggled with this necessity, knowing she was erasing these children's pasts to save their futures. But the alternative was death, so the erasing continued. Financial support for hidden children came from multiple sources. The Zagota organization, funded by the Polish government in exile, provided money for food, clothing, and bribes. Jewish organizations in the ghetto contributed what resources they could spare. Individual donors supported specific children. The network operated on a shoestring budget, but it operated. Every zloty spent keeping a child fed was a zloty that saved a life. The scale of the operation expanded dramatically in summer 1942 when the gross action began. Starting July 22nd, the Germans launched systematic deportations from the ghetto to Treblinka. Over 300,000 Jews would be murdered in the following months. Children were loaded onto cattle cars with their parents, transported to the camp, and gassed upon arrival. The deportations accelerated Sendler's rescue efforts. Every day counted. Every hour might mean the difference between rescue and deportation for specific children. The network smuggled children with increasing urgency and risk. Sendler herself made daily trips into the ghetto, identifying orphans and persuading parents to surrender children while there was still time. The emotional toll was crushing. She witnessed families being torn apart, children screaming for parents being dragged away, guards beating people onto deportation trains. She could save perhaps 10 or 20 children per week, while thousands were being murdered. The mathematics of inadequacy haunted her, but she continued because saving 20 was better than saving none. The Gestapo was not blind to the fact that children were disappearing from the ghetto. They increased security, interrogated suspects, and executed people suspected of assisting escapes. The Blue Police, Polish collaborators who guarded the walls, became more vigilant after their German masters demanded results. Several network members were arrested, tortured, and killed without revealing the organization's structure or Sendler's identity. The executions demonstrated what awaited anyone caught, but they also demonstrated that the network's security protocols were working. Captured members died without betraying others. Sendler developed increasingly sophisticated operational security. She used code names and dead drops to minimize direct contact between network members. Information was compartmentalized so that capture of one cell wouldn't compromise the entire organization. The records buried in glass jars used code that would be meaningless to anyone without the key. Meeting locations changed constantly. Trust was extended cautiously and verified continuously. These precautions saved lives when the inevitable happened. On October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo arrested Irina Sendler. Someone had informed, though whether from torture, betrayal, or accident was never determined. The Germans had been watching her for weeks, documenting her movements and contacts. They knew she was smuggling children, but not the full scope of the operation. They arrested her expecting that torture would break her quickly and expose the entire network. They were wrong. The interrogation at Pawiak prison lasted for months. The Germans employed every technique of physical and psychological torture. They broke her feet and legs with hammers. They beat her unconscious repeatedly. They threatened to arrest her mother. They promised her freedom if she would name just one co-conspirator. Sendler revealed nothing, not one name, not one address, not one detail that could compromise the children she had saved or the network that had saved them. The Gestapo's frustration grew with each interrogation session. They had broken everyone else. Why not this woman? Weber personally supervised the torture, convinced that everyone had a breaking point. Sendler's breaking point apparently exceeded the Germans' capacity to inflict pain. She maintained her cover story. She was a social worker checking for disease. She had permission to enter the ghetto. Any children she assisted were relocated for medical treatment through official channels. She knew nothing about illegal smuggling. Her injuries from falling downstairs were evidence of her clumsiness, nothing more. The Germans sentenced her to death. She was scheduled for execution in January 1944. The underground learned of the sentence and executed one of the most daring rescue operations of the war. Zagota bribed a German guard at Pauiak prison to assist in Sendler's escape. On the scheduled execution day, the guard reported that Sendler had already been shot, and her name appeared on the executed prisoners list posted publicly. In reality, the guard had smuggled her out the day before the execution. Sendler went into hiding with false identity papers, recovering from her injuries while continuing to coordinate the children's network from underground. The Gestapo never discovered that their most wanted fugitive had escaped. They believed she was dead and buried in a mass grave. Meanwhile, Sendler continued her work under an assumed name, coordinating the care of children already rescued, while the opportunities for new rescues disappeared as the ghetto was systematically liquidated. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943 and its brutal suppression ended most smuggling operations. The remaining Jews were either killed in the fighting or deported to camps. The window for rescue had closed, but the work of protecting hidden children continued. Over 2,500 Jewish children were living under Polish identities across Warsaw and the surrounding regions. Each required ongoing support, protection, and security. The network that had smuggled them out now focused on keeping them safe until liberation. The Germans still hunted for hidden Jews, paying bounties to informers and executing Poles caught harboring them. Discovery remained a constant threat. The children themselves carried the operation's secrets, often unknowingly. Young children who had forgotten their Jewish identities were safest because they couldn't accidentally reveal themselves. Older children who remembered had to live in constant fear of saying the wrong thing or forgetting their Catholic prayers. The psychological burden was immense. These children had lost their parents, their names, their religion, their entire world. They survived physically, but carried emotional scars that would last lifetimes. Sendler maintained the buried records throughout the occupation's final years. The glass jars under the apple tree contained the only comprehensive documentation of the children's true identities. If those records were lost, the children would be lost to their heritage forever. If the records were discovered by the Germans, the children would be lost to murder. The jars represented both hope and danger, buried secrets waiting for liberation that might never come. The liberation of Warsaw came in January 1945, when Soviet forces finally drove the Germans from the city's ruins. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 had reduced much of the city to rubble. The districts where Sendler had operated were destroyed. Many of the families hiding Jewish children had been killed in the fighting or fled the advancing front. But the glass jars survived, retrieved from the garden and unsealed to reveal their precious contents. The post-war challenge was reuniting children with surviving family members. Sendler and her colleagues began the heartbreaking work of tracing relatives and attempting reunifications. Most children had no surviving family. Their parents, grandparents, siblings, and extended families had been murdered in the camps. The children Sendler had saved were often the sole survivors of entire family lines. Those who had been very young when rescued had no memory of their Jewish identities and had become Polish Catholics in every meaningful sense. Telling them their true origins often traumatized them further. The reunifications that did occur were complicated and sometimes tragic. A mother who had survived Auschwitz sought her daughter, only to find that the girl didn't recognize her and wanted to stay with the Polish family that had raised her. A father, reunited with his son, discovered the boy now spoke only Polish and crossed himself when frightened. The joy of survival was mixed with the grief of permanent loss. The Holocaust had stolen not just lives, but identities, communities, and connections that could never be fully restored. The scale of Sendler's achievement became clear only after the war, when historians analyzed the records and interviewed survivors. She and her network had rescued approximately 2,500 Jewish children from certain death. The number exceeded the rescues attributed to any other single individual during the Holocaust. Each child represented a life saved, a family line preserved, a future possible. The 2,500 became thousands more as the rescued children grew, married, and had families of their own. But recognition came slowly and incompletely. Communist Poland after the war had little interest in celebrating resistance operations that had been loyal to the Polish government in exile rather than the Soviet-backed regime. Sendler's work was barely acknowledged. She returned to social work, living in poverty while the children she had saved scattered across Poland and eventually around the world. Many never learned who had rescued them or how. The woman who had risked everything to save them remained unknown to those whose lives she had preserved. The West was equally ignorant of Sendler's achievement. The Holocaust's rescuers who received early recognition were those whose stories fit convenient narratives or had powerful advocates. Raoul Wallenberg's diplomatic protection of Hungarian Jews was celebrated. Oskar Schindler's protection of factory workers became famous through Thomas Keneally's novel and Steven Spielberg's film. Sendler's rescue of children through a resistance network remained obscure, known to specialists but not to the broader public. The first significant recognition came in 1965, when Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, designated Sendler as righteous among the nations. This honor recognized non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Sendler traveled to Jerusalem to receive the award and plant a tree in the Garden of the Righteous. The ceremony was emotional, bringing her face to face with some of the children she had saved, now adults with families of their own. They thanked her for lives they had almost not lived, for children and grandchildren who existed only because of her courage. But broader recognition still eluded her. The communist regime in Poland actively suppressed information about Zagota and other Home Army resistance activities, preferring to emphasize communist partisan groups. Sendler's story remained largely unknown outside specialist circles. She lived in modest circumstances, her health permanently damaged by the Gestapo torture. She never spoke of herself as a hero, insisting that she had simply done what any decent person would do in her circumstances. The breakthrough to international recognition came unexpectedly in 1999 through an American high school project. Students in a rural Kansas classroom researching Holocaust rescuers encountered a brief mention of Irina Sendler in a footnote claiming she had saved 2,500 children. The students initially thought it was a typographical error. Surely it meant 250, not 2,500. How could someone that heroic be so unknown? Their teacher, Norman Conrad, challenged them to investigate. The students discovered that Sendler was still alive, living in a Warsaw nursing home at age 89. They wrote to her and received a response. Over the following months, they researched her story, interviewed survivors, and created a play called Life in a Jar that dramatized her rescue operation. The play was performed locally, then regionally, then nationally. Media coverage followed. Suddenly, at age 90, Irina Sendler became internationally famous. The final years of Sendler's life brought the recognition she had been denied for 6 decades. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, losing to Al Gore, but gaining widespread media attention. The Polish government, now freed from communist rule, belatedly honored her with the country's highest civilian decorations. She received honors from Israel, the United States, and numerous international organizations. Most importantly, she heard from hundreds of the children she had saved and their descendants who wrote to thank her for lives made possible by her courage. Sendler died on May 12, 2008 at age 98. Her funeral in Warsaw was attended by Holocaust survivors, government officials, and representatives from around the world. The children she had saved, now elderly themselves, came to pay final respects to the woman who had given them life. They carried photographs of their children and grandchildren, living evidence of her achievement. One survivor told reporters that Sendler had saved not just him, but his 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Multiply that by 2,500, and Sendler's rescue had created tens of thousands of lives across 3 generations. The legacy of Irina Sendler extends beyond the numerical achievement of children saved. Her story demonstrates that individual action matters even against overwhelming evil. She faced a system designed to make rescue impossible and proceeded anyway. She risked torture and death not once but daily for years. She recruited others to similar risk and built an organization that functioned despite constant threat. She maintained operational security under interrogation that would have broken most people. She preserved records that documented her work and enabled post-war reunifications. She did all this not for recognition or reward, but because her values demanded it. The contrast with those who collaborated or remained passive is stark. Most Poles under German occupation focused on personal survival. Helping Jews meant risking execution for oneself and one's entire family. The calculus of self-preservation argued overwhelmingly for inaction, yet Sendler and hundreds of others in her network chose to act anyway. They decided that some things mattered more than survival, that moral duty outweighed personal safety, that remaining human required resisting inhumanity regardless of cost. The Gestapo had believed that terror would prevent Polish resistance. They executed people publicly to intimidate others into compliance. They offered bounties for information about hidden Jews, creating economic incentives for betrayal. They promoted propaganda claiming Jews were dangerous disease carriers who threatened Polish health. They created a system designed to make rescue materially, socially, and psychologically impossible. Sendler proved that impossible meant merely very difficult. Courage and organization could overcome terror and propaganda. The children Sendler saved carried complicated relationships with their rescue throughout their lives. Some were grateful but traumatized, their childhoods stolen by necessity of hiding. Others embraced their Jewish heritage after years of living as Catholics, reclaiming identities they had been forced to abandon. Still others remained Catholic, viewing their rescue as the beginning of a new life rather than interruption of an old one. There was no single narrative, no common response. Each child processed their experience individually, shaped by age at rescue, memory of parents, and post-war circumstances. The moral complexity of the rescues continues to generate discussion. Sendler had separated children from parents who were subsequently murdered. Was this rescue or abduction? The answer depends on circumstances. Parents who voluntarily surrendered children hoping to save them made informed choices under duress, but some children were taken when parents were deported or killed, removed without parental consent. These were arguably kidnappings, even if motivated by humanitarian intent. The ethics of wartime rescue exist in shades of grey that defy easy judgment. Similarly complex is the question of religious conversion. Jewish children were baptized Catholic and raised in Christian households. Many lost all connection to Jewish identity and heritage. After the war, some Jewish organizations sought to reclaim these children for the Jewish community, arguing they had been stolen from their heritage. Polish Catholic families, who had risked everything to save these children, resisted surrendering them. Both sides had legitimate claims. The children themselves, especially those rescued young, often identified more with their Catholic upbringing than their biological Jewish origins. Who had the right to determine their futures? These questions have no easy answers. Sendler herself struggled with them throughout her life. She had saved lives but could not save childhoods, families, or identities. The children survived, but at costs that only became fully apparent after liberation. Would parents who died at Treblinka have approved of their children being raised Catholic with no memory of Jewish heritage? Impossible to know. But the alternative was death for those children. Imperfect rescue was infinitely preferable to perfect annihilation. The organizational achievement Sendler represented deserves emphasis. She didn't rescue 2,500 children alone. She built and coordinated a network of hundreds of people who performed specific roles in a complex operation. Forgers created false documents, safe house operators harbored children, couriers transported information and money, bribed guards looked away at critical moments, social workers identified children for rescue, medical personnel sedated children for smuggling. Each person in the network faced execution if caught, yet all continued working because Sendler's leadership made them believe success was possible. This organizational capacity distinguished Sendler from individual rescuers who saved small numbers through personal action. She created a system that functioned even when she was imprisoned. The network continued operating in her absence because she had built redundancy and distributed authority. When she escaped from prison, she resumed coordination, but the operation hadn't collapsed in her absence. This systematic approach multiplied her individual capacity many times over. The financial aspects of the rescue operation are often overlooked. Each child required money for false documents, transportation, placement payments to families, and ongoing support. Multiply this by 2,500 children over several years, and the costs reached hundreds of thousands of zlotys. Sendler coordinated fundraising through Zagota, Jewish organizations, and individual donors. She maintained financial records despite the risks, ensuring accountability and preventing corruption. The rescue operation was not just morally courageous but administratively competent. The gender dimension of Sendler's achievement merits consideration. She operated in a male-dominated society and resistance movement where women were typically relegated to support roles. Yet she led a major operation, commanded respect from male colleagues, and made life-and-death decisions affecting thousands. Her gender actually provided advantages in some contexts. Germans viewed women as less threatening, making her movements less suspicious. Cultural expectations that women worked in social services made her ghetto access more credible. She weaponized the enemy's sexism against them. The comparison with other Holocaust rescuers illuminates Sendler's unique contribution. Raoul Wallenberg saved tens of thousands through diplomatic protection, but he had governmental authority and resources Sendler lacked. Oskar Schindler saved approximately 1,200 through his factory, but he had wealth and Nazi party connections unavailable to Sendler. The Danish resistance saved over 7,000 Jews through coordinated effort, but they had geographical advantages and government support. Sendler operated alone initially, built her network from scratch, and worked under constant threat with minimal resources. Her achievement was proportionally greater given the constraints she faced. The documentation Sendler maintained proved invaluable for historians and survivors. The glass jars buried in the garden contained the only comprehensive record of smuggled children's true identities. Without these records, most children would have been permanently lost to Jewish community and heritage. The meticulous documentation reflected Sendler's understanding that rescue wasn't complete until families could be reunited. She planned for peace, even while fighting through war. The torture Sendler endured and survived deserves somber reflection. The Gestapo broke her body but not her will. She maintained silence through pain that drove many to suicide or betrayal. This psychological strength came from clarity of moral purpose. She believed absolutely in what she had done and those she protected. That belief sustained her through interrogation that would have broken lesser commitments. Her silence saved not just the network, but the 2,500 children, whose locations would have been revealed through her confession. The post-war silence about Sendler's achievements reflected broader patterns of Holocaust memory. Communist regimes suppressed stories that celebrated non-communist resistance. The Catholic Church was ambivalent about publicizing Catholics who saved Jews, fearing it would invite questions about why more hadn't acted. Israel focused on stories with clear heroes and villains, rather than morally complex cases. Sendler's story fit awkwardly into all these frameworks, consigned to obscurity until the political and cultural climate changed enough to permit recognition. The Kansas students who rediscovered Sendler demonstrated how individual curiosity can recover lost history. Their teacher's assignment led them to research that uncovered a story the experts had footnoted but not explored. Their play brought Sendler's achievement to public attention decades after the events. This shows that historical memory is not fixed, but constantly reconstructed through new generations' engagement with the past. The students became part of Sendler's story by telling it to audiences who had never heard it. The question of what motivated Sendler has no simple answer. She credited her father's example and teaching. She mentioned Catholic values of loving your neighbor. She spoke of basic human decency requiring action against obvious evil. She rejected the label of hero, insisting she had done what anyone should do. But clearly not everyone did act. Most people under occupation prioritized survival over resistance. Sendler was exceptional precisely because she did what most people did not do. The final toll of Sendler's network can never be precisely calculated. The number 2,500 represents documented rescues, but the network likely saved others whose records were lost or never created. Some children were smuggled in emergency situations without time for documentation. Some records may have been destroyed deliberately or accidentally. The true number could be higher, perhaps significantly. But even using the conservative documented figure, Sendler saved more Jewish children than any other individual rescuer during the Holocaust. The children she saved went on to live lives their parents never saw. They became doctors, teachers, artists, and scientists. They married and raised families. They built lives in Israel, America, Poland, and around the world. They contributed to their communities and humanity in ways large and small. Every medical breakthrough by one of these survivors, every child they taught, every kindness they showed to others, multiplied the impact of Sendler's rescue. She saved not just 2,500 individuals, but countless future contributions those individuals would make. The Gestapo officer who tortured Sendler, SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Weber, faced justice after the war. He was tried for war crimes including torture and murder of Polish resistance members. He was convicted and executed in 1947. His belief that everyone had a breaking point was disproved by Sendler. His confidence that torture would reveal her network's secrets was wrong. He died having failed to break the Polish social worker who had defeated him through moral strength he couldn't comprehend. The families who harbored Jewish children deserve recognition alongside Sendler. They accepted death sentences for themselves and their families by agreeing to hide Jewish children. They maintained deceptions for years under constant threat. They came to love children they knew might be reclaimed by surviving relatives. They shared scarce food during starvation. They risked everything for children who were not their own. Sendler coordinated the network, but these families executed the daily work of protection that made rescue meaningful. The Polish underground state that supported Sendler's work operated an entire shadow government under occupation. Zagota, the Council to Aid Jews, was unique among European resistance organizations in dedicating significant resources specifically to saving Jewish lives. The organization coordinated rescuers, provided funding, created false documents, and maintained security protocols that protected operations. Sendler worked within this larger framework, benefiting from its resources while contributing to its humanitarian mission. The children's experiences after rescue varied enormously. Some lived openly as Catholic Poles, fully integrated into their host families. Others lived in hiding, confined to attics or cellars with their Jewish identities known to the family but concealed from neighbors. Some were placed in convents or orphanages among dozens of other children. Some were alone with families in rural areas. Some maintained some Jewish practices in secret. Others abandoned all connection to Judaism. Each situation was unique, shaped by local circumstances and the specific family's capacity to protect them. The psychological toll on children who survived through Sendler's network emerged slowly over decades. Many suffered from what would later be called survivor's guilt, struggling with why they lived when parents and siblings died. Some experienced identity confusion, unsure whether they were truly Polish or Jewish. Some blocked traumatic memories entirely, living decades before recovering suppressed knowledge of their origins. The rescue had saved their lives, but could not save them from psychological wounds that persisted. Sendler's own psychological response to her work combined pride and sorrow. She was proud of saving lives, but tortured by those she couldn't save. She could not forget the parents who begged her to take their children, the children who cried for parents being deported, the thousands who died while she saved dozens. The mathematics of inadequacy haunted her. She spoke of this burden in her final years, explaining that being called a hero was painful because she remembered failures more vividly than successes. The transformation of Sendler from obscure pensioner to international icon in her final decade was both gratifying and overwhelming. She was in failing health, still suffering effects of Gestapo torture 60 years earlier. Suddenly, she faced media attention, official ceremonies, and constant requests for interviews. She cooperated because she understood that publicity honored not her, but the children she saved, and the network that saved them. She used her platform to remind people that good had existed amid evil, that ordinary people could resist extraordinary horror, that moral choice remained possible even under tyranny. The comparison between Nazi efficiency at murder and Sendler's network's efficiency at rescue is instructive. The Germans had industrial killing capacity, railroads dedicated to deportation, guard systems to prevent escape, bureaucracies to process victims. They killed millions. Sendler's network had bribes, sedatives, false papers, courage. They saved thousands. The disparity reveals both the horror of genocide and the heroism of resistance. The Germans commanded state power. Sendler commanded conscience. Conscience saved fewer but mattered more. The lessons Sendler's story teaches transcends Holocaust history. It speaks to universal questions about moral responsibility, individual agency, and collective action. When confronting overwhelming evil, individuals often feel powerless and use that feeling to justify inaction. Sendler demonstrated that powerlessness was partly illusion. She had no army, no wealth, no special authority. She had determination and recruited others who shared it. Together, they accomplished what each alone could not. This is the pattern of effective resistance across human history. Individuals linking together multiply their capacity geometrically. The modern world faces different forms of evil than Nazi genocide, but the moral questions remain similar. When we witness injustice, do we act or rationalize inaction? When action requires personal risk, do we accept it or prioritize safety? When systems seem overwhelming, do we work to change them or submit to them? Sendler's example suggests answers. Act despite risk. Organize others to multiply impact. Persist despite odds. Value lives over comfort. These principles transcend specific historical contexts. The glass jars buried under the apple tree serve as perfect metaphor for Sendler's achievement. She preserved truth through darkness, planning for future light. The jars survived occupation, war, and decades of communist suppression. When finally unsealed, they revealed names, identities, and histories that could have been lost forever. This is what resistance does. It preserves humanity through inhumanity, maintains memory through amnesia, ensures that evil cannot erase good entirely. Irina Sendler rescued 3,000 Jewish orphans from Warsaw Ghetto trains and the death that awaited them. She built a network that defeated the Gestapo through courage and organization. She endured torture without betraying those she protected. She lived to see her work recognized and the children she saved thriving as adults with families of their own. She demonstrated that individual action matters, that resistance is possible, that conscience can defeat terror. Her story is one of the brightest lights in the darkest chapter of human history. She was a nurse who saved 3,000 lives. She was a hero who never accepted the title. She was a woman who proved that goodness can survive even when surrounded by evil. And she was a rescuer whose legacy lives in thousands of descendants who exist only because she refused to accept that saving lives was impossible.